tears streaming down her face. Elara Kingsley gripped the pen with trembling fingers. The divorce papers spread before her like a death sentence. It was Christmas Eve. Behind her, the towering evergreen tree glittered with crystal ornaments and white lights. Beautiful, indifferent witnesses to her destruction. She had no idea that the documents she was about to sign would do more than end her marriage. They would activate a clause hidden in plain sight, one that would transform her from the family's discarded mistake into the architect of their downfall. What happens next will make you question everything you think you know about power, silence, and the danger of underestimating a woman who has nothing left to lose. Before we dive into this story, if you love real-life stories about justice, hidden truths, and powerful women rising from the ashes, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it. You're already here, already hooked. And I promise the stories on this channel will keep you on the edge of your seat every single time. Drop a like on this video and comment below telling me where you're watching from. Lagos, London, New York, Dubai. I want to know. Now let's get back to Elara's story, because what unfolds in the next few minutes is absolutely devastating. The Kingsley mansion stood like a fortress on the north side of the city, wrapped in evergreen garlands and thousands of twinkling lights that made it glow against the winter sky. Inside the sprawling estate, the scent of spiced cider, roasted chestnuts, and expensive perfume mingled in the air. Christmas carols played softly from hidden speakers while relatives gathered in elegant clusters, champagne glasses catching the light from chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. This was the Kingsley Christmas Eve gathering, a tradition that showcased wealth, power, and the family's untouchable status in society's highest circles. In the center of the grand living room, beneath a vaulted ceiling adorned with fresh pine garlands and silk ribbons, Elara sat at the edge of a velvet settee, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. She wore a simple emerald dress. The color Victor had once said brought out her eyes, but tonight it felt like a costume from a life that no longer belonged to her. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, and her face, though still beautiful, was streaked with tears she no longer had the energy to wipe away. Across from her, arranged like a tribunal in matching wingback chairs, sat the Kingsley matriarch, Diane Kingsley, flanked by Victor's two sisters, Helena and Margot. They watched Elara with expressions that ranged from bored impatience to thinly veiled contempt. The divorce papers sat on the mahogany coffee table between them, like evidence at a trial where the verdict had already been decided. "Are you going to sign? Or do we need to call security to escort you out?" Diane asked, her voice cool and measured. She was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, pearls at her throat, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Her eyes were ice blue, the same color as Victor's, but where his once held warmth, hers had always been winter. Elara didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze on the papers, on the bold letters that spelled out petition for dissolution of marriage, on the empty line waiting for her signature. "Mother asked you a question," Helena said sharply, leaning forward. She was the older sister, 42 and polished to perfection in a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers. "The least you can do is respond when spoken to." "I'm signing," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. I need a moment." Margot laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "A moment? You've had 3 years of moments. 3 years of living off our family name, wearing our jewelry, pretending you belonged in our world." "I never pretended," Elara said, her voice cracking. "I love Victor. I thought he loved me too." "Love," Diane repeated, as if testing the word in her mouth and finding it distasteful. "How romantic. But let's be honest, dear. You saw an opportunity, a handsome, wealthy man from an influential family, and you took it. That's not love. That's strategy. That's not true." Elara protested weakly, tears spilling fresh down her cheeks. "We met at the library. He approached me. We talked for hours about books, and 6 months later you were married," Helena cut in. "In a small ceremony that none of us were invited to, might I add. You rushed him to the altar before he could think clearly. He wanted it that way," Elara said desperately. "He said he didn't want all the fuss, that he just wanted it to be about us. Of course he did, Margot interjected, examining her perfectly manicured nails. Because he knew we would have talked sense into him. We would have insisted on a prenuptial agreement. We would have protected him from this. She gestured vaguely at Elara, as if she were something distasteful that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. Elara turned, searching the room for Victor. She found him standing near the marble fireplace, surrounded by his father, uncles, and several cousins. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his posture relaxed and casual. He was nodding along to something his cousin was saying, a slight smile on his lips. He looked completely at ease, as if this was just another holiday gathering and not the night his wife was being forced to sign away their marriage. "Victor," Elara called out, her voice breaking on his name. "Please, just talk to me. Just look at me." The conversation around him stopped. His relatives turned to stare at her, their faces arranged in various degrees of pity and judgment. Victor slowly set his glass down on the mantel, straightened his shoulders, and turned to face her. His expression was blank, carefully neutral, the face of a stranger. "What do you want me to say, Elara?" he asked, his tone flat. "I want you to tell them this is wrong," she said, standing on shaking legs. "I want you to remember who we were, what we promised each other. I want you to fight for us." He was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Elara felt the last fragment of hope crumble inside her chest. "There's nothing to fight for," he finally said. "My family's right. We're incompatible. We always were. I thought I could make it work, but—" He shrugged, a gesture so casual it felt like a slap. "I can't. And honestly, it's better we end it now before things get more complicated." "More complicated?" Elara repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "Victor, we're married. We made vows. Before God, before witnesses. Before you trapped him, you mean?" Helena said coldly. "Let's not pretend this was some grand romance. You came from nothing, a rented apartment in a neighborhood no one in this room has ever driven through, working as a substitute teacher, living paycheck to paycheck. Then suddenly you're wearing designer clothes and dining at restaurants you couldn't have afforded on a year's salary. I never asked for any of that," Elara said, her voice shaking. "I would have been happy with him in a one-bedroom apartment. I didn't marry him for his money. Didn't you?" Diane stood, walking slowly toward Elara with the measured steps of a woman accustomed to commanding every room she entered. When she reached the coffee table, she picked up the papers and held them out. "Sign these," she said quietly. "Victor has already agreed. His signature is on page 12. This marriage is over. All that's left is your acknowledgement of that fact." Elara took the papers with numb fingers, flipping through until she found Victor's signature, bold, confident, already dried. He'd signed them hours ago, maybe even days ago. He'd made this decision without even telling her, without giving her a chance to what? Fight for a man who was already gone? "The settlement is generous," Diane continued, her voice almost gentle now, the way you'd speak to a child. $200,000. Enough to start over somewhere far from here. Enough to disappear quietly and rebuild whatever life you had before you met my son. "I don't want your money," Elara whispered. "Everyone wants money, dear," Margot said with a smirk. "Don't play noble now. Take it and go." Elara looked around the room, at the relatives who had once smiled at her, who had welcomed her at Thanksgiving and complimented her dress at charity galas. Aunt Catherine, who had hugged her and called her family just 6 months ago, now whispered behind her hand to a cousin. Uncle Richard, who had toasted her at the wedding, now stood with his arms crossed, looking at his watch as if this was keeping him from something important. Now they all watched her with cold eyes, waiting for her to break completely, waiting for the final humiliation. Even the staff members stationed near doorways looked away, uncomfortable witnesses to her unraveling. A phone camera flashed. Someone near the entrance was recording. This wasn't just a private dissolution. This was a public execution. "Sign the papers, Elara," Victor said from across the room. His voice wasn't cruel, just tired. "Let's not drag this out." Her hand moved to the pen. It felt heavy, impossible. But what choice did she have? She was surrounded by people who didn't want her, who had never wanted her. She was alone in a room full of witnesses to her failure. "You're all cruel," she said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Every single one of you." "We're realistic," Diane corrected, settling back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone who'd just won a negotiation. "You don't belong in this world, Elara. You never did. And deep down, I think you always knew that." The words landed like stones. Elara felt something inside her fracture completely. Not her heart, which had already broken, but something deeper. Her sense of self, maybe the belief that love could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle. She lowered herself back onto the settee, the papers trembling in her hands. Through her tears, she began to read, not to delay, but because some part of her brain, the part that had helped her survive 28 years of life without family money or connections, told her to pay attention. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Both parties agree to terms as outlined below. Settlement amount: $200,000 to be paid in full within 30 days. No claim to Kingsley family assets, trusts, or holdings. No further contact with Victor Kingsley or immediate family members. Her eyes caught on a line near the bottom of page 3. Subject to terms of the Kingsley Family Trust, established 1987, as amended. Something flickered in the back of her mind. A conversation late one night in their first year of marriage. Victor had been drinking wine, relaxed and unguarded, talking about his grandfather's paranoia about gold diggers and social climbers. He'd laughed about the ridiculous clauses the old man had put in the trust. He was obsessed with protecting the family fortune, Victor had said. Made all these rules about marriage and divorce. Like anyone would actually enforce them now. Elara hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, "Are you finished reading your shopping list?" Margot asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or do you need us to explain the big words?" Elara ignored her. Her eyes moved to the next section. By signing this agreement, both parties acknowledge full disclosure of all relevant financial instruments and legal obligations, including, but not limited to. There was a reference number. A clause designation, KFT-7B. "I need to read this carefully," Elara said, her voice steadier than it had been in the last hour. "Before I sign." "There's nothing to read," Helena snapped. "You get money, you leave, you never come back. It's simple." "Then you won't mind if I take a few minutes," Elara said, still scanning the pages. Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. "The terms are non-negotiable. If you think you can." "I'm not negotiating," Elara interrupted quietly. "I'm reading." A tension rippled through the room. Victor's father, Howard Kingsley, stepped forward from his position near the fireplace. He was a tall man in his 70s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms. "Let her read," he said calmly. "We have nothing to hide." But something in his tone made Elara's pulse quicken. It was the voice of a man who believed what he was saying, but maybe shouldn't. She turned to the final page. There, in small print at the bottom, was another reference. "See attached schedule for complete financial disclosure as required under KFT-7B provisions." "Where's Schedule A?" Elara asked. "Not relevant," Diane said quickly. "That's just legal boilerplate. If it's not relevant, then where is it?" "You're stalling," Margot accused. "I'm being thorough," Elara countered, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Maybe it was because she'd already lost everything. Maybe it was because she had nothing left to fear. "If I'm signing away my marriage and any claim to this family, I want to make sure I understand exactly what I'm signing." Victor crossed the room, his footsteps deliberate against the hardwood floor. He stopped a few feet from her, looking down with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Just sign it, Elara," he said quietly. "Please, let's just end this." There was something in his voice, not cruelty, but something else. Resignation, maybe, or was it guilt? She looked up at him, this man she'd loved, this man who'd promised her forever 3 years ago in a small chapel with wildflowers and no witnesses except the officiant. His eyes were the same ice blue as his mother's, but right now they looked tired. "Did you ever love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Even for a moment, He didn't answer right away. Someone coughed. A glass clinked against the table. "I thought I did," he finally said. "But I was wrong." Those words, "I was wrong," cut deeper than any insult his family had thrown at her. Because they meant she'd been a mistake. Their entire relationship, every moment of happiness she'd clung to, had been an error in judgment he was now correcting. Elara picked up the pen. Her hand was steadier now. The tears had stopped, leaving only a cold, hollow ache in her chest. She pressed the pen to paper and signed her name in careful, deliberate script. Elara Marie Kingsley. For the last time, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Margot actually clapped her hands once, a sharp sound of satisfaction. Helena reached for her phone, already texting someone. Diane took the papers from the table, glancing over the signature with an approving nod. "There," she said. "That wasn't so difficult, was it?" Elara stood slowly, smoothing down her dress with shaking hands. She felt hollow, scooped out, like a shell of the person who'd walked into this mansion earlier that evening expecting Christmas dinner and conversation about baby names for the child she and Victor had planned to try for next year. "The money will be wired to your account within the week," Howard said from his position near the fireplace. "I trust you'll be moved out of the penthouse by the weekend?" "I'll be gone by tomorrow," Elara said quietly. "Good," Diane replied, setting the papers in a leather portfolio. "I'll have someone pack your things and send them to whatever address you provide. No need for you to come back to the apartment." Of course, they were erasing her completely, efficiently, the way you delete a file from a computer. Elara walked toward the entrance hall, her legs unsteady beneath her. No one moved to stop her. No one said goodbye. She was already a ghost to them, a problem solved, a mistake corrected. At the doorway, she paused and turned back. Victor stood near his mother, accepting a fresh glass of bourbon from his father. The family was already reforming around him, closing the gap where she'd been, smoothing over the disruption. In 5 minutes, it would be as if she'd never existed. "Merry Christmas," Elara said softly. No one responded. She walked out into the cold December night, snow beginning to fall in soft, silent flakes. The circular driveway was lined with luxury cars, Mercedes, Teslas, a Bentley. Her rideshare was waiting at the end, a beat-up Honda Civic that looked painfully out of place among the wealth. As she climbed into the back seat, Elara caught sight of the mansion one last time through the rear window. It glowed like a palace from fairy tale, warm and golden and impossibly beautiful. She'd been a princess there once. Now, she was just a girl going home to an empty apartment with a settlement check that felt like 30 pieces of silver. The driver pulled away, and the mansion disappeared behind a wall of snow-covered trees. Elara leaned her head against the cold window and finally, completely, allowed herself to break. She cried for the marriage she'd lost, for the love she'd believed in, for the family she'd hoped to build. But somewhere, beneath the grief and the humiliation and the crushing sense of failure, a tiny spark of something else flickered to life. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. She'd read those papers carefully. She'd seen the references, the clause numbers, the missing Schedule A that Diane had dismissed as boilerplate. And Elara had survived 28 years without money or connections by being smart, resourceful, and very, very thorough. The Kingsleys had made a mistake tonight. They'd assumed she was broken. They'd assumed she would disappear. They'd assumed she didn't matter. And that assumption, that single arrogant miscalculation, would be the crack in their foundation. By the time the car pulled up to her building 40 minutes later, Elara's tears had dried. Her hands had stopped shaking, and she'd made a decision. She wasn't going to disappear. Not until she understood exactly what she'd signed. And not until she knew what KFT-7B meant. What Elara doesn't know yet is that those 3 letters and 1 number, KFT-7B, are about to change everything. But first, she needs to understand how she got here. How a woman who met a man in a library ended up signing divorce papers on Christmas Eve while his family laughed. That story begins 2 years earlier, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when Victor Kingsley walked into the public library and asked her a question that would change both their lives forever. 2 years and 4 months earlier, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in March, Elara had been shelving books in the history section when a man's voice interrupted her concentration. "Excuse me, do you work here?" She turned to find him standing in the aisle, tall, well-dressed in a navy pea coat and dark jeans, with ice blue eyes that seemed to actually see her, not just look past her the way most patrons did. "Not officially," she'd answer with a small smile. "I'm a volunteer, but I can help you find something." "I'm looking for a first edition of anything by James Baldwin," he'd said. "My father has a birthday coming up, and Baldwin was his favorite author." They talked for 20 minutes in that quiet aisle, rain drumming against the windows, about Baldwin and Hemingway, and whether digital books would ever truly replace the feel of paper. He made her laugh. He'd listened when she spoke, and when he'd asked for her number, she'd given it without hesitation, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, possibility. "I'm Victor," he'd said, shaking her hand, "and I have a feeling we're going to know each other for a long time." He'd been right, just not in a way either of them had imagined. Now, sitting in the back of the rideshare as it navigated through snowy streets, Elara replayed that first meeting in her mind and tried to find the moment it had all gone wrong. When had the man who'd spent 3 hours talking to her about books become the man who'd sat silent while his family humiliated her? Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Coffee dates that stretched into dinner, weekend trips to art galleries and bookstores. Victor had been attentive, charming, genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams. He'd asked about her childhood, her parents who'd passed when she was 19, the substitute teaching job she worked while trying to finish her master's degree in literature. "You're real," he'd told her once, his hand warm in hers as they walked through a park at sunset. "Everyone in my world is performing all the time. But you're just you." She'd fallen in love with him because he'd seemed different from what she'd imagined wealthy men to be. He'd been humble about his family status, almost embarrassed by it. When he'd finally told her his last name was Kingsley, the Kingsleys who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, he'd done it quietly, apologetically. "I want you to know me as Victor," he'd said. "Not as a trust fund or portfolio. Just me." And she had. She'd known him as the man who brought her coffee in the mornings, who read poetry aloud in bed, who'd proposed to her on a rooftop under a sky full of stars with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Marry me," he'd whispered, his forehead pressed against hers. "Marry me before my family tries to make this into something it's not. Let's just be us." They'd married 6 months after meeting, in a small ceremony at a chapel outside the city. No family, no press, no elaborate planning. Just them, an officiant, and promises that had felt sacred and unbreakable. "I'll protect you," Victor had said when they'd exchanged vows. "From anything, from anyone. I promise." The car hit a pothole, jolting Elara back to the present. She wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying again. How had those promises become so meaningless? How had the man who'd sworn to protect her become the man who'd let his mother dictate the terms of her erasure? She thought about their first year of marriage, the happiness that had felt so genuine. Victor introducing her to his world slowly, carefully. The penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The charity galas where he'd kept his hand on the small of her back, anchoring her when she felt out of place among socialites and philanthropists. "You belong here," he'd insisted whenever she'd expressed doubt. "You belong with me." But she'd started noticing the cracks by their second year. The way Victor would go quiet when his mother called. The business dinners that stretched later and later. The increasing time he spent at the family office, coming home exhausted and distant. "It's just work stress," he'd said whenever she'd asked if something was wrong. "The company's expanding. My father's talking about retirement. There's a lot of pressure." She believed him because she'd wanted to. Because the alternative that he was pulling away, that his family was pulling him away, was too painful to consider. The final year had been the worst. Victor's mother, Diane, had started making pointed comments about Elara's background, her lack of connections, her unsuitability for the Kingsley image. His sisters had stopped inviting her to family events, citing immediate family only for gatherings Elara had once been welcome to. And Victor? Victor had stopped defending her, stopped fighting back, stopped being the man who'd promised to protect her from anything. "Can't you just try to fit in better?" he'd asked one night after a disastrous dinner with his parents. Maybe dress more conservatively. Talk less about books and more about the foundation work. They just need time to warm up to you. She'd stared at him, shocked. You want me to change who I am? I want you to make an effort, he'd replied, not meeting her eyes. Is that so much to ask? It had been the beginning of the end, though she hadn't recognized it then. She'd tried, God, how she'd tried, to become what they wanted. She'd bought designer clothes she couldn't afford. She'd attended lunches with Diane and her daughters, enduring their thinly veiled criticisms with forced smiles. She'd volunteered for every charity event, hoping to prove her worth. But nothing had been enough, because the problem wasn't what she did or didn't do. The problem was who she was, a substitute teacher from a rented apartment who'd married into a world that protected its borders like a fortress. The car pulled up to her building, a modest mid-rise in a neighborhood that was safe but unremarkable. Nothing like the gleaming penthouse she'd shared with Victor. Nothing like the mansion she'd just left. Elara paid the driver and stepped out into the falling snow. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, a one-bedroom she'd kept throughout her marriage despite Victor's insistence that she didn't need it. I might need it someday, she'd said, though she'd never imagined it would be like this. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached her door, she had to dig through her purse for keys she hadn't used in months. The lock stuck, rusty from disuse, but finally gave way. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Sparse furniture, books stacked on every surface, a picture of her parents on the small dining table. It smelled stale, unlived in, like a time capsule from the life she'd had before Victor. Elara closed the door behind her and locked it. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, blurred by snow and distance. Somewhere out there, in a mansion glowing with Christmas lights, the Kingsleys were celebrating. Probably relieved. Probably already forgetting she'd ever existed. Victor was probably drinking bourbon, laughing with his cousins, his signature already dry on papers that erased 3 years like they were nothing. 3 years of her life. 3 years of love and promises and hope. Rewritten as a mistake. Reframed as a phase. Reduced to a settlement check and a non-disclosure agreement. A mistake, Diane had called it. We rushed into things, Victor had said. As if their wedding hadn't been real. As if their mornings together, their late-night conversations, their plans for the future, as if none of it had mattered. Elara pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let the reality settle over her like the snow settling on the city below. She was alone. She was discarded. She was exactly what they'd always believed her to be, disposable. But as she stood there in the darkness of her forgotten apartment, something shifted in her chest. Not acceptance, not peace, clarity. She turned away from the window and walked to the small desk in the corner where she'd left her laptop 2 months ago. She opened it, the screen glowing to life in the dim room. Then she pulled the divorce papers from her purse, the copies they'd given her, and spread them across the desk. KFT-7B. Schedule A. Kingsley Family Trust, established 1987, as amended. They dismissed her as uneducated, unsophisticated, too simple to understand complex legal language. They'd made a mistake, because Elara had spent 3 years married to Victor Kingsley. 3 years with access to his home office, his files, his casual conversations about family business. 3 years of being invisible in rooms where powerful people spoke freely because they'd forgotten she was there. She opened a search engine and typed, Kingsley Family Trust 1987. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, Elara began to read. The days after Christmas passed in a blur of silence and snow. Elara didn't leave her apartment. She ordered groceries through an app, ignored the stack of mail accumulating by her door, and kept her phone face down on the coffee table where its silence felt less accusatory. Victor didn't call. Not once. No text asking if she'd made it home safely. No email about logistics or belongings left behind. Nothing. The man who'd once sent her good morning messages and called during his lunch breaks had erased her as completely as if she'd never existed. By the 3rd day, Elara stopped checking her phone entirely. She spent hours sitting by the window, watching the city move below her, people walking dogs, couples holding hands, families carrying shopping bags full of post-holiday returns. The world continued as if nothing had changed, as if her entire life hadn't imploded on Christmas Eve. The crying came in waves. Sometimes she'd be fine, making tea or folding laundry, and then suddenly she'd remember the way Victor had looked at her, or rather, through her, and the grief would hit like a physical blow. She'd find herself on the floor, sobbing into her hands, unable to breathe past the weight in her chest. Other times it was anger, pure, white-hot rage at the injustice of it all. She'd pace her small apartment, replaying every cruel word Diane had spoken, every dismissive glance from Helena and Margot, every moment of Victor's silence. How dare they? How dare they treat her like trash to be discarded? The sleepless nights were the worst. She'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning through every moment of her marriage, searching for the warning signs she'd missed. Had Victor ever really loved her? Or had she been convenient, a rebellion against his family's expectations that he'd eventually outgrown? I thought I did, but I was wrong. His words haunted her in the dark. On the fourth day after Christmas, Elara made the mistake of checking social media. The photos were everywhere. Victor at a New Year's charity brunch, smiling broadly in a tailored suit, his arm around Simone Cartwright. Simone with her perfect posture and pearls, her Spelman degree in Martha's Vineyard Summers. Simone who fit. The caption on the society page read, "Victor Kingsley and longtime family friend Simone Cartwright ring in the new year together." Sources say the two have been growing closer in recent months. Could wedding bells be in the future? Recent months, while Elara had still been his wife, while she'd been sleeping beside him, making him breakfast, planning their future. She threw her phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern that somehow felt appropriate. 5 days after Christmas, the money appeared in her bank account. $200,000. Elara stared at the number on her laptop screen, feeling nothing. It should have felt like security, like freedom, like a fresh start. Instead, it felt like blood money. Payment for her silence. Compensation for 3 years of her life. She closed the laptop without touching it. That night, unable to sleep again, Elara finally retrieved the divorce papers from where she'd left them on her desk. She'd been avoiding them, as if not looking would somehow make them less real. But now, in the quiet of 3 a.m. with nothing but street lights and insomnia for company, she spread them across her coffee table and began to read. Really read. Not through tears, not with shaking hands, but with the careful attention she'd once applied to dense literary criticism and archival research during her graduate studies. Page 1. Standard dissolution language. Page 2. Custody arrangements, not applicable. Property division, waived. Page 3. Settlement terms, confidentiality clause, non-disparagement agreement. Page 4. Liability waivers, indemnification, representation of counsel. And there, on page 5, buried in a paragraph of dense legal language, both parties acknowledge that this dissolution is executed in accordance with and subject to the provisions of the Kingsley Family Trust KFT, as established in 1987 and subsequently amended in 1995, 2003, and 2019. Both parties affirm full disclosure of all relevant trust provisions, including but not limited to marital stability clauses as outlined in KFT Section 7, subsection B. Elara read the paragraph 3 times. Then she grabbed her laptop and opened it, ignoring the banking notification still displayed on the screen. She typed, "Marital Stability Clause Trust Law." The results were technical, full of legal jargon, but the basic concept was clear enough. Marital stability clauses were provisions wealthy families built into trust to protect assets from divorce. They could include penalties for divorcing within certain time frames, requirements for prenuptial agreements, or conditions that had to be met for beneficiaries to maintain access to trust funds. Elara sat back, her mind racing. Victor hadn't asked her to sign a prenup. She'd found that odd at the time, surprising for a family as wealthy as the Kingsleys. But Victor had insisted it was because he trusted her, because he didn't want their marriage to start with assumptions about ending. "My family thinks I'm crazy," he'd said with a laugh. "But I told them we're not getting divorced. So what's the point? What if the point was that a prenup wasn't necessary? What if the trust itself already had protections built in?" She pulled up a new search, Kingsley Family Trust. Most of what appeared were puff pieces about the family's philanthropy, their business holdings, their social prominence. But buried on the third page of results was a brief mention in a legal journal from 2003 about estate planning strategies for high-net-worth families. The article mentioned the Kingsley Trust as an example of a comprehensive multi-generational asset protection vehicle with innovative marital stability provisions designed to discourage frivolous or hasty divorces among beneficiaries. Elara's pulse quickened. She searched for the full text of the trust document, public record, she hoped, but found nothing. Trusts were typically private and less involved in litigation. But the divorce papers had referenced full disclosure of all relevant trust provisions. Where was that disclosure? She flipped through her copies again, more carefully this time. Every page was numbered. Page 1 of 12, page 2 of 12, page 3 of 12. She reached the final page, page 12 of 12. But the reference on page 5 had mentioned attached schedule for complete financial disclosure as required under KFT-7B provisions. There was no Schedule A in her copies. Elara set the papers down and pressed her palms against her eyes, thinking. Diane had rushed her through the signing, had physically held the papers, flipping pages, pointing to signature lines. Had anyone actually shown her Schedule A? Or had they just told her it was boilerplate and not relevant? The anger from earlier returned, but this time it was cold, focused. They'd made her sign documents without full disclosure. They'd referenced a trust provision, but hadn't actually shown her what it said. And they'd done it in front of a room full of witnesses who'd been too busy mocking her to notice the irregularity. Or maybe they hadn't noticed because they didn't know either. Elara opened a new browser tab and searched for law libraries in the city. There were 3, including one at the university where she'd done her graduate work. She still had her alumni access card somewhere. The pain in her chest, the grief that had been crushing her for days, was still there, but had company now, curiosity, and beneath that, something sharper, purpose. She looked at the clock, 4:17 a.m. The law library opened at 8 o'clock. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Elara felt something other than devastation. She felt awake. She stood, walked to her closet, and pulled out clothes she hadn't worn in days. She showered, washed her hair, forced herself to eat toast and drink coffee. By 7:30 a.m., she was dressed and standing by her door, car keys in hand. The Kingsleys thought she would disappear, thought she would take their money and fade quietly into whatever life she'd had before Victor. They'd underestimated her, all of them, because Elara had spent 3 years being underestimated, being dismissed, being treated as if her lack of pedigree meant a lack of intelligence. But she had a master's degree in literature. She knew how to research. She knew how to dig through archives and cross-reference sources and find needles in haystacks of information. And she had nothing but time. Elara opened her apartment door and stepped into the hallway. She wasn't going to collapse. She was going to investigate, and she was going to find out exactly what KFT-7B meant. The university law library smelled exactly as Elara remembered. Old paper, lemon polish, and the faint mustiness of documents that had survived decades. She'd spent countless hours here during her graduate studies, researching copyright law for her thesis on literary estates. Now she was here for an entirely different kind of estate. The main reading room was nearly empty at 8:15 on a winter morning. A few law students hunched over laptops, and a woman with silver hair sat behind the reference desk, reading glasses perched on her nose. Elara approached cautiously. "Excuse me, I'm looking for public records related to family trusts. Specifically, any filings or amendments that might be part of probate records." The woman looked up, her sharp eyes assessing. Estate planning documents are generally private unless they've been through probate court. "Do you have a case number or deceased name?" "James Kingsley," Elara said. "He died in 2019. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "The James Kingsley? Kingsley Properties? Yes. A pause. Then, you family? I was married to his grandson. Elara's voice was steady. I'm doing research on the family trust structure. The woman studied her for a long moment, and Elara had the distinct feeling she was being evaluated for something beyond simple library protocol. Margaret Chun, the woman finally said, extending her hand. I'm the lead archivist here. 30 years in estate law before I retired to this. She gestured around the library. Come with me. She led Elara to a private research room in the back, lined with filing cabinets and computer terminals. Margaret closed the door and turned to face her. I'm going to be direct with you, Margaret said. I know who the Kingsleys are. Everyone in legal circles does. And I know you're Elara Kingsley because I read about your divorce in the society pages 3 days ago. Elara's stomach dropped. Of course. The divorce was public record now. Filed and sealed and reported. I'm not here to cause trouble, Elara said quickly. I just want to understand. What you signed, Margaret finished. Smart. Most people in your position would take the money and run. She pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for Elara to do the same. What specifically are you looking for? The divorce papers reference something called KFT-7B, a marital stability clause. But they didn't give me the actual clause, just made me sign acknowledging it existed. Margaret's expression sharpened. They didn't provide Schedule A? No, that's problematic. Margaret turned to her computer and began typing. James Kingsley's estate went through probate in 2019. The trust document itself is private, but certain filings, amendments, asset transfers, beneficiary designations, those become public record when they interact with the court system. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. The Kingsley Family Trust was established in 1987 by James Kingsley Sr., Victor's great-grandfather. It's been amended several times to add beneficiaries and adjust provisions as the family grew. She clicked through several screens. Here, 1995 amendment, filed in probate court because it involved the transfer of real property that required title changes. She turned the monitor toward Elara. The document was dense with legal language, but Margaret pointed to a specific section. Section 7B, Marital Stability Provisions. Margaret read aloud. To protect the integrity of family assets and discourage hasty or opportunistic marriages, the following conditions apply to all trust beneficiaries. Any beneficiary who divorces within 7 years of marriage shall forfeit their position as primary beneficiary. All assets, distributions, and decision-making authority shall be redistributed according to the contingent beneficiary structure outlined in Section 12. Elara's heart began to pound. 7 years. Keep listening. Margaret scrolled down. However, if said divorce is initiated by the beneficiary or their family within the 7-year period, and if the marriage has produced no legal heirs, the forfeiture penalty shall be doubled, and the former spouse shall be entitled to claim standing as a contingent beneficiary with rights to financial audit and asset transparency. The room seemed to tilt. I don't understand, Elara said, though she was beginning to. Victor and I were married for 3 years. We divorced within 7 years. And who filed for divorce? Margaret asked. They did. His family. They made me sign. Who filed with the court? Elara thought back to the papers. She pulled out her copies and found the filing page. Petitioner, Victor James Kingsley. Margaret leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Oh, they screwed up. What do you mean? Victor filed. Within 7 years. No children. According to this clause, he just forfeited his position as primary beneficiary. Margaret pulled up another document. Let me check the contingent beneficiary structure. She scrolled through pages of names and percentages. Primary beneficiaries are the direct descendants. Victor, his sisters, his cousins. But if a primary beneficiary forfeits, their share doesn't disappear. It goes to contingent beneficiaries, which include... She stopped. Spouses married for more than 1 year. Elara couldn't breathe. You were married for 3 years, Margaret continued, her voice excited now, the way scholars get when they discover something fascinating. According to Section 7B, subsection C, You're not just entitled to your settlement. You're entitled to audit rights, financial transparency, and depending on how the redistribution math works out. She pulled up a calculator and started entering numbers based on the trust structure. Victor's share as primary beneficiary was approximately 30% of trust distributions. If he's forfeited and you're the only qualifying contingent beneficiary for his portion. She turned the screen toward Elara. The number made no sense. Too many zeros. That can't be right, Elara whispered. It's an estimate, but the trust is worth approximately $340 million in liquid assets, not counting real estate holdings and business interests. 30% of that, even partially. Margaret shook her head. They gave you $200,000 to go away. But if this clause applies the way I think it does, you could be entitled to a significant portion of Victor's forfeited share. Possibly million. Elara's hands started shaking. Why wouldn't they know this? His mother, his father, they're not stupid. They wouldn't have pushed for divorce if. When was James Kingsley's will probated? 2019, 5 years ago. And when did Victor's father become trustee? Elara tried to remember conversations, casual mentions. I think his uncle is the trustee. Howard is just an advisor. Margaret pulled up more documents. Here, trustee, Richard Kingsley, James's younger brother. He's been managing the trust since James died. She looked at Elara. It's possible the immediate family doesn't know the full provisions. Complex trusts like this often have clauses that only the trustee and the attorneys fully understand. The family members just know they get distributions. So they forced a divorce without realizing what it would trigger. Exactly. Margaret sat back. The question is, did they fail to disclose Schedule A on purpose, or did they genuinely not know it mattered? Elara thought about Diane's dismissiveness, Helena's impatience, the way they'd all seemed so confident that this was a simple erasure. No hesitation, no concern. They hadn't known. What do I do? Elara asked, her voice small. Margaret's expression softened. You need a lawyer. A very good one. Someone who specializes in trust litigation and isn't afraid of powerful families. I can't afford. You can afford whatever you need now, Margaret interrupted gently. You have $200,000 in the bank and a potential claim worth exponentially more. Any competent attorney would take this on contingency in a heartbeat. Elara looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but not from grief now. From something else. Salt. Fear. And underneath it all, something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Quiet, dangerous hope. I need to think, she said. Don't think too long, Margaret warned. Statutes of limitation apply to these things. And the longer you wait, the more time they have to discover their mistake and try to fix it. Elara stood on unsteady legs. Can I get copies of everything you just showed me? Already printing. Margaret gestured to a printer in the corner, pages emerging one by one. And Elara, be careful. The Kingsleys have resources and connections. If they realize what you've found, they'll come after me, Elara finished. They'll bury you. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Make sure you have someone in your corner before you make a move. Elara gathered the printed documents, her mind reeling. She'd come here looking for understanding, for context, for some explanation of what she'd signed. She'd found a weapon. The Kingsleys had discarded her like garbage, assuming she was too broken and too insignificant to matter. They'd assumed wrong. Elara left the library with a folder full of documents and Margaret's business card tucked in her purse. The winter air hit her face, sharp and clarifying. She had a decision to make. Take the money and disappear, just as they'd expected, or fight. By the time she reached her car, Elara had made her choice. She pulled out her phone, cracked screen and all, and searched for top trust litigation attorneys in the city. Then she started making calls. The law offices of Chun and Associates occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower downtown. All clean lines and minimalist furniture that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Elara sat in the reception area, her folder of documents clutched in her lap, tried to ignore the way her reflection looked in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Small, out of place, still wearing the same coat she'd been wearing on Christmas Eve. Miss Kingsley, A woman appeared in the doorway, tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. "I'm Patricia Chen. Please come in." Elara followed her into a corner office with a view of the city that made her apartment seem even more insignificant by comparison. But Patricia's smile was warm, genuine, as she gestured to a leather chair across from her desk. "Margaret called me," Patricia said, settling into her own chair. "My mother doesn't call in favors often, so when she does, I listen. She says you've stumbled onto something interesting." "Your mother?" Elara blinked. "Margaret Chun, the archivist who helped you yesterday." Patricia's smile widened. "She's been retired for 5 years and still finds ways to meddle in my cases. But in this instance, I'm grateful. May I see what you brought?" Elara handed over the folder, watching as Patricia's expert eyes scanned the documents. Her expression remained neutral, but Elara noticed the slight pause when she reached the marital stability clause, the way her fingers tapped once against the desk. Finally, Patricia looked up. "Tell me everything. Start from Christmas Eve." Elara talked for 20 minutes straight. The forced signing, the missing Schedule A, the discovery at the library, the clause that no one had explained to her. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Elara finished, Patricia set down her pen and leaned back. "First, let me be clear about what you're dealing with," she said. "The Kingsleys are one of the most influential families in this city. They have attorneys on retainer who've been practicing longer than I've been alive. They have judges who attend their charity dinners and politicians who owe them favors. If we pursue this, it won't be easy or pleasant." Elara's heart sank. "But, however," Patricia continued, her voice sharpening with something that looked like satisfaction, "they made a critical error. Multiple errors, actually. They had used signed documents without full disclosure of relevant trust provisions. That alone could be grounds to invalidate the agreement. But more importantly, they triggered a forfeiture clause that fundamentally changes Victor's status as a beneficiary." "So it's real? What your mother found?" "It's real." Patricia pulled up a document on her computer. "I pulled a full trust filing this morning. KFT Section 7B is ironclad. Any beneficiary who divorces within 7 years forfeits their primary position. The trust was designed by James Kingsley Sr. in the 1980s, during his second divorce. He was obsessed with preventing gold diggers from accessing family wealth, so he created a structure that actually penalized his own descendants for divorcing quickly. But they call me the gold digger," Elara said, the irony bitter in her mouth. "Projection," Patricia said simply. "They accuse you of what they feared, never considering that their own actions would trigger the very protections designed to stop people like you." She pulled up a spreadsheet. "Based on the trust structure and Victor's share, your potential claim, conservatively, is somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The number hit Elara like a physical force. She gripped the arms of her chair. That's not possible. It's not only possible, it's legally mandated. The trust is a binding document. Once the forfeiture was triggered, the redistribution is automatic. The question isn't whether you're entitled to this money. The question is whether they'll fight you for it. Will they?" Patricia's expression hardened. "Absolutely. They'll claim you don't qualify as a contingent beneficiary. They'll argue the clause doesn't apply because the divorce was mutual. They'll bury us in motions and delays and try to exhaust your resources before we ever see a courtroom. Then what's the point?" Elara felt the hope from yesterday crumbling. "I can't fight them. I don't have." "You have me," Patricia interrupted. "And you have something more powerful than money. You have the truth. They violated disclosure requirements. They acted in bad faith. And most importantly, they documented everything." She tapped the divorce papers. "They created a paper trail of their own arrogance." Elara took a shaky breath. "What do we do?" "We have 2 options." Patricia stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the city. "Option 1. We approach them privately. We present our findings, negotiate a settlement that's fair but quiet. You'd get significantly more than $200,000. They'd avoid public exposure. Everyone moves on with their dignity intact." "And option 2? Patricia turned, her expression unreadable. "We file a formal claim. We force a full audit of the trust. We make this public, messy, and legally binding. You'd get everything you're entitled to under the law, but it would be a war. Months, maybe years of litigation. Your name in the papers. Their attorneys attacking your character. It would be brutal, but I'd win. Based on what I've seen? Yes. Eventually. The law is clear, and their mistake is documented. But winning in court and surviving the process are two different things. Elara looked out at the city, at the gleaming towers where families like the Kingsleys lived and worked, protected by money and influence and the assumption that people like her couldn't touch them. She thought about Christmas Eve, about Diane's cold dismissal, Helena's cruel laughter, Margot's casual cruelty, about Victor sitting silent while they destroyed her, then going out days later with Simone Cartwright, as if Elara had never existed. What would you choose? Elara asked quietly. Patricia returned to her desk and sat down, her gaze steady. If it were me, I'd make them face what they did. Publicly. On record. But I'm not you, and this isn't my life they'll try to destroy. You need to decide what you can live with. Across town, in the Kingsley Mansion's dining room, the family gathered for lunch. Diane presided at the head of the table, Victor to her right, his sisters flanking them. Howard sat quietly at the far end, reading something on his phone. I heard Simone's parents are hosting a New Year's gala, Helena said, spearing a piece of salmon. Victor, are you going? Victor shrugged, looking relaxed in a way he hadn't in months. Probably. Simone already asked. Good, Diane said approvingly. It's time to move forward properly, with someone appropriate. Is the divorce finalized? Margot asked. No loose ends. All signed and filed, Victor confirmed. She took the settlement without any fuss. It's done. Thank God, Helena muttered. I thought she'd try to drag it out. Diane raised her wine glass. To moving on from mistakes. They clinked glasses, none of them noticing the slight frown on Howard's face as he continued scrolling through his phone, reading an email from his brother Richard, the trust administrator. Have you reviewed the marital stability provisions recently? James's old paranoia might have created complications with Victor's situation. We should discuss. Howard set his phone down, uneasy settling in his stomach. But when he looked up, his family was laughing, confident, already rewriting history to erase the brief chapter called Elara. He decided it could wait until after the holidays. Back in Patricia's office, Elara made her decision. I want them to face it, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Publicly, on record, I want them to know they can't just erase people because it's convenient. Patricia nodded slowly. Then we need to be strategic. Timing matters. We file when it will have maximum impact, when they're least prepared to respond. When would that be? They're hosting their annual charity gala in a week, Patricia said, pulling up a society page on her computer. 500 guests, live auction, press coverage. They use it to showcase their family image. Powerful, philanthropic, untouchable. She looked at Elara. We file the claim that morning. By the time the gala starts, it'll be public record. Reporters will have the story, and they'll have to face their guests knowing what's coming. That's cruel, Elara said softly. They humiliated you in front of their entire family on Christmas Eve, Patricia countered. This is justice. Elara thought about it for a long moment. Then she nodded. Do it. You're sure? Once we file, there's no going back. I'm sure. Patricia extended her hand. Then let's show them what happens when they underestimate the wrong woman. Elara shook it, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not the weight of grief anymore. Not the shame of rejection. Power. For the first time since Christmas Eve, Elara Kingsley felt powerful. And the Kingsleys had no idea what was coming. The Kingsley Mansion blazed with light on the evening of the annual charity gala. Caterers moved through the kitchen with military precision. Waiters arranged champagne flutes on silver trays, and a string quartet tuned their instruments in the grand ballroom. Outside, valets prepared for the arrival of 500 of the city's most influential residents, senators, CEOs, philanthropists, and socialites who treated this event as the unofficial start of the social season. In the master suite upstairs, Diane Kingsley fastened a diamond necklace around her throat and examined her reflection with satisfaction. The emerald gown fit perfectly. Her hair was styled in elegant waves, and at 68, she looked a decade younger. Tonight would be flawless, as it always was. "Mother, have you seen my cufflinks?" Victor appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his tuxedo, his hair still damp from the shower. "Which ones?" "The platinum ones, with the Kingsley crest. Check your father's study. He borrowed them last month." Diane turned from the mirror. "You look handsome. Simone will be impressed." Victor's expression flickered, something that might have been guilt, but passed too quickly to identify. "It's not about impressing her. We're just friends. For now," Diane said knowingly. "But these things have a natural progression. Her family expects it. Your family expects it. And after that unfortunate chapter with, well, it's time to move forward properly." She couldn't even say Elara's name anymore. As if not speaking, it would erase those 3 years more completely. "She wasn't that bad, Mother," Victor said quietly. Diane's expression hardened. "She was exactly that bad. Wrong family, wrong background, wrong everything. You were in rebellion, darling. We all understood that. But now you're back on track, and tonight we celebrate everything this family has built. Our legacy, our position, our future." Victor nodded, though something in his posture suggested uncertainty. He'd been sleeping poorly since Christmas, waking in the middle of the night with a feeling he couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or just the discomfort of knowing he'd hurt someone who'd never deserved it. But his mother was right. It had to be done. Elara hadn't fit, would never have fit, and prolonging it would only have caused more pain. At least, that's what he told himself. Downstairs in the drawing room, Helena and Margot sipped champagne while their husbands talked business near the fireplace. Both sisters wore designer gowns and enough jewelry to fund a small country's economy. "Did you see the guest list?" Helena asked. "The governor is coming. And that tech mogul from California. The one who just donated $50 million to the Arts Foundation." "Good," Margot said. "We need more young money at these events. Half the attendees are father's generation. We need to start building relationships with the next wave of wealth." Speaking of which, Helena lowered her voice. "Has anyone heard from you-know-who?" "Elara." Margot said the name with distaste. "God, no. She took her money and disappeared, just like we knew she would. Probably back in some dreary apartment, crying into her wine and shopping online with our settlement check." They both laughed. "Victor seems better," Helena observed. "More relaxed. Did you see him with Simone at the New Year's brunch?" "They looked natural together." "Because they're natural," Margot said. "Same world, same values, same everything. That's how it should be. Not some random library girl who thought she could play Cinderella." "Do you think she'll cause problems?" Helena asked. "Try to sell a story to the press or something pathetic like that." "She signed an NDA," Margot reminded her. "If she says one word publicly, our attorneys will destroy her. She knows that. She's not stupid, just delusional." Howard Kingsley stood near the windows, only half listening to his daughter's conversation. He'd been distracted all week, ever since his brother Richard had sent that cryptic email about the trust provisions. He tried to follow up, but Richard had been traveling, unreachable. It was probably nothing. The trust had been in place for decades without issue. One divorce couldn't possibly complicate something so well established. Still, the unease lingered. "Howard!" Diane appeared at his elbow, her voice sharp. "The photographer is here for family portraits. Stop brooding and come smile for the camera." He followed her to the foyer, pushing his concerns aside. Tonight was about celebration, about showing the world what the Kingsley family represented. Whatever minor administrative questions existed about the trust could wait until after the gala. By 7 o'clock, guests began arriving. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, women in evening gowns and men in tuxedos ascending the marble steps. Inside, the mansion gleamed, every surface polished, every flower arrangement perfect, every detail curated to project power and grace. Victor stood near the entrance with his parents, greeting arrivals with practiced charm. Simone appeared at 8, stunning in a navy gown that matched her eyes, and slipped her hand into the crook of his arm with comfortable familiarity. "You look beautiful," Victor said, meaning it. "So do you," she replied with a smile. "Shall we?" They moved into the ballroom together, and Victor felt a dozen approving gazes follow them. This was right. This was what his life was supposed to look like. Clean, appropriate, uncomplicated. So why did he keep glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see someone who would never come? 15 miles across the city, in her small apartment, Elara stood before her bathroom mirror and hardly recognized herself. The woman staring back wore a simple black dress, not designer, but elegant in its simplicity. Her dark hair was pulled into a low chignon, her makeup minimal but polished. She looked composed, calm, nothing like the crying, broken woman who'd signed divorce papers 2 weeks ago. Patricia had advised against attending the gala. "Let the legal filing speak for itself," she'd said. "You don't need to face them in person." But Elara had insisted. She needed to see their faces when they realized what was coming. Needed to stand in that ballroom and show them she wasn't destroyed, wasn't disappeared, wasn't finished. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Filing went through this morning. Public record as of 9 a.m. Press picked it up an hour ago. Several outlets running stories now. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Elara typed back, "I'm sure." Another text. "Car service is outside. Good luck. Call me if you need anything." Elara took one last look at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, stronger than she remembered being, harder than she'd ever wanted to be. But the world had made her this way. The Kingsleys had made her this way. She picked up her small clutch and walked to the door. The car ride took 20 minutes. Elara watched the city pass outside the window, her heart rate climbing as they approached the familiar neighborhood, the familiar gates, the familiar mansion glowing like a beacon against the dark sky. Cars lined the driveway. She could hear music drifting from inside, see silhouettes moving behind the windows. The gala was in full swing. The driver pulled up to the entrance and came around to open her door. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "are you ready?" Elara took a breath, then another. She thought about Christmas Eve, about tears and humiliation and the casual cruelty of people who'd never been told no, about Victor's silence and Diane's ice and the photographs people had taken of her misery. She thought about the trust clause they'd forgotten, about the mistake they'd made, about the power they'd handed her without realizing it. "I'm ready," she said. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the marble steps. The door was open, light and warmth spilling out, the sound of laughter and conversation, and a string quartet playing something classical and beautiful. Elara walked through the entrance, into the lion's den, and this time she was the one with teeth. The ballroom fell silent in waves. First, the guests nearest the entrance stopped mid-conversation, champagne flutes pausing halfway to lips. Then the silence spread like ripples across water, through clusters of senators and tech moguls, past the string quartet who faltered on their notes, until even the waiters stopped moving and the entire room stood frozen, staring at the woman who just walked through the doors. Elara stood at the top of the 3 steps leading down into the ballroom, her black dress stark against the opulence surrounding her. She wasn't crying, wasn't trembling. Her head was high, her expression calm, and she wasn't alone. Patricia Chen stood beside her in a burgundy gown, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm. And flanking them both was a man Elara had met only that afternoon. David Morrison, Patricia's colleague, and one of the most respected trust litigation attorneys in the state. The silence stretched. Then the whispers began. "Is that the ex-wife? What is she doing here? I thought she was paid off." Across the ballroom, near the auction tables displaying this year's luxury prizes, Victor's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. He stared at Elara as if seeing a ghost. Simone Cartwright, still holding his arm, looked between them with dawning confusion. "Victor? Who is that?" He couldn't answer. His throat had closed, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Elara was supposed to be gone, disappeared, living quietly somewhere far from here with her settlement money and her wounded pride. She wasn't supposed to be here, certainly not looking like that, composed, and almost regal, flanked by attorneys, scanning the room with the calm assessment of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Diane Kingsley moved first. She descended from the small stage where she'd been speaking with the auctioneer and crossed the ballroom floor with measured steps, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers. Her expression was controlled, but something dangerous flickered in her ice-blue eyes. "Elara," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "This is a private event. You weren't invited." "I know," Elara replied, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not here as a guest." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones began emerging from pockets and purses, recording. Diane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then I'm afraid you'll need to leave. We can have security escort you out if necessary." "That won't be necessary," Patricia Chun said, stepping forward. "I'm Patricia Chun, Ms. Kingsley's legal counsel. We're here on official business related to the Kingsley Family Trust." The murmurs grew louder. Howard Kingsley pushed through the crowd, his face pale. Helena and Margot followed, their expressions shifting from shock to anger. "What is this about?" Howard demanded, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "That email from Richard. The trust provisions." The unease he'd been pushing aside for days. Patricia opened her portfolio and removed a document. "This morning, we filed a formal claim with the probate court regarding violation of disclosure requirements in the divorce proceedings between Victor and Elara Kingsley, as well as activation of the marital stability clause outlined in KFT Section 7B. The room erupted. Voices rose in confusion and excitement. The press representatives in attendance, invited to cover the charity aspect of the gala, suddenly became alert, sensing a much bigger story. "This is absurd," Diane said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We followed every legal requirement. The divorce was clean, settled, finalized." Without proper disclosure, Patricia interrupted calmly. Ms. Kingsley was not provided with Schedule A, which outlined the specific trust provisions affected by the divorce. Provisions that, once triggered, fundamentally alter the beneficiary structure. Victor finally found his voice. "Elara, what are you doing?" She turned to look at him fully for the first time since entering. He looked different than he had on Christmas Eve. Less confident, more uncertain, almost vulnerable in his confusion. "What I should have done from the beginning," Elara said quietly. "Standing up for myself." "You signed the papers," Margot interjected, pushing forward. "You agreed to the terms. You can't just change your mind because you're bitter." "I signed papers I wasn't allowed to fully review," Elara corrected, her voice still calm. "Papers that referenced legal provisions I was never shown. That's called coercion and failure to disclose. Any first-year law student knows it." Helena laughed, sharp and cruel. "You can't be serious. You think you can challenge this family? Our attorneys are already aware of the filing." David Morrison spoke for the first time, his deep voice commanding attention. As is the probate judge, the trust administrator, and, as of approximately 2 hours ago, several major news outlets. Howard's face went from pale to gray. "Richard," he said hollowly. "Does Richard know?" "Your brother was served with notice this afternoon," Patricia confirmed. As the trust administrator, he's required to provide full transparency during the audit process. "Audit?" Diane's voice cracked slightly on the word, the first sign of her composure fracturing. "A complete financial audit of the trust, its distributions, and its beneficiary structure," Patricia said. "Standard procedure when a marital stability clause is triggered." The silence that fell now was different from before. Heavier, charged with dawning realization. 500 guests watched as one of the city's most powerful families stood exposed, their private financial arrangements about to become public record, their carefully curated image cracking in real time. Diane opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Everyone, please," she turned to address the crowd, attempting to regain control. "This is a misunderstanding that will be resolved privately. If we could all just—" "Mrs. Kingsley," Patricia said, her voice professional but firm. "I'm afraid it's already public. The filing became public record this morning. The press has been reporting on it for hours." As if on cue, Several guests pulled out their phones, refreshing screens, eyes widening as they read headlines. Kingsley divorce triggers trust crisis. Ex-wife claims fraud in high-profile separation. Charity gala interrupted by legal bombshell. Diane swayed slightly, and Howard caught her elbow. For the first time in Elara's memory, the Kingsley matriarch looked genuinely shaken. Victor moved toward Elara, pushing past his mother and sisters. "Elara, please, can we talk about this privately? Whatever you think we did." "I don't think," Elara interrupted softly. "I know. And no, we can't talk privately. You had your chance for private conversations. Christmas Eve, remember? When you sat silent while your family destroyed me in front of everyone." His face flushed. Around them, guests recorded everything on their phones. Patricia stepped forward slightly, positioning herself between Elara and the family. "If there's nothing else, we've accomplished what we came to do. The legal process will proceed through proper channels." "Wait," Howard said, his voice desperate. "Just wait. Can we at least discuss this? Surely there's a reasonable compromise." "We're past compromises," David Morrison said. "Your family had the opportunity for reasonable discussion. Instead, you chose intimidation and incomplete disclosure. Now the court will decide what's reasonable." Patricia turned to Elara. "Are you ready?" Elara looked around the ballroom one last time, at the faces staring at her, some with pity, some with fascination, some with the dawning respect of people who recognized power when they saw it shift. At Victor, still frozen in shock. At Diane, her diamond necklace suddenly seeming less like armor and more like a collar. At Helena and Margot, their earlier cruelty replaced with genuine fear. "I'm ready," Elara said. And then, with her attorneys beside her and 500 witnesses watching, Elara Kingsley walked back out of the mansion. Not running, not crying, not broken, walking. Behind her, the ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices rising, phones buzzing, the carefully orchestrated evening collapsing into scandal. The last thing Elara heard as the door closed behind her was Diane Kingsley's voice, shrill and desperate. "Someone call Richard. Call him now. We need to fix this." But outside in the cold winter air, Elara smiled. Because there was nothing to fix. The clause had been triggered. The filing was public. And the Kingsleys' carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. The probate courtroom was nothing like the grand ballroom, where the Kingsleys usually held court. It was sterile and functional. Fluorescent lights, wood-paneled walls, rows of gallery seating that were now packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and members of the city's legal community who'd heard about the case and came to witness history. 3 weeks had passed since the gala. 3 weeks of motions and countermotions, emergency filings, and legal maneuvering. The Kingsleys had thrown everything at Elara. Character attacks in the press, allegations of gold digging and manipulation, teams of attorneys arguing procedural technicalities. But Patricia Chun had been right. The law was clear, and their mistake was documented. Now, on a gray February morning, Judge Margaret Rothstein presided over the hearing that would determine the enforcement of the trust clause. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for being unimpressed by wealth or influence. Elara sat at the plaintiff's table between Patricia and David Morrison, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wore a navy suit, professional, appropriate, the uniform of someone who belonged in this room. Across the aisle, the Kingsley family occupied 3 rows. Victor sat at the defense table with their lead attorney, Marcus Webb, a silver-haired man whose hourly rate could fund a small business. Behind them, Diane sat ramrod straight, flanked by Howard, Helena, and Margot. Their expressions ranged from barely controlled rage to genuine fear. Richard Kingsley, the trust administrator, sat separately with his own counsel, looking like a man who wished he were anywhere else. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Margaret Rothstein presiding. Everyone stood. The judge entered, settled at her bench, and reviewed the documents before her with meticulous attention. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, she looked up. "This is a petition to enforce provisions of the Kingsley Family Trust, specifically Section 7, subsection B, commonly known as the marital stability clause. Her voice was crisp, neutral. "Ms. Chun, you may present your case." Patricia stood, moving to the center of the room with the confidence of someone who knew she'd already won. "Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. On December 24th of last year, Elara Kingsley was coerced into signing divorce papers without proper disclosure of relevant trust provisions that would be triggered by said divorce." She pulled up a document on the courtroom's display screen. The divorce papers explicitly referenced Schedule, which was to contain complete financial disclosure as required under KFT-7B provisions. Ms. Kingsley was never provided with this schedule. Objection. Marcus Webb stood. The disclosure was standard and complete. Mrs. Kingsley's signature indicates her acknowledgement. Her signature indicates coercion. Patricia cut in smoothly. She was surrounded by hostile family members, pressured to sign immediately, and explicitly told the missing schedule was not relevant when she asked about it. She pulled up another document. "We have testimony from household staff who were present that confirms this timeline and the circumstances." Judge Rothstein studied the documents. "Mr. Webb, do you have Schedule A?" A pause. "Your Honor, the schedule was prepared but not formally attached because the settlement terms superseded." "That's a no," the judge said flatly. "Continue, Ms. Chun." Patricia advanced to the next slide. The trust document, established in 1987 and amended multiple times, contains explicit language regarding divorce within 7 years of marriage. She read aloud. "Any beneficiary who divorces within 7 years of marriage shall forfeit their position as primary beneficiary. All assets, distributions, and decision-making authority shall be redistributed according to the contingent beneficiary structure." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Furthermore, Patricia continued, "If said divorce is initiated by the beneficiary or their family within the 7-year period, the forfeiture penalty shall be doubled, and the former spouse shall be entitled to claim standing as a contingent beneficiary." "Your Honor, this is absurd." Marcus Webb tried to interrupt. Judge Rothstein held up a hand. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Webb." "Ms. Chun." Patricia pulled up a marriage certificate. Victor and Elara Kingsley were married for 3 years and 2 months, well within the 7-year window. Next slide, the divorce filing. The petition for dissolution was filed by Victor Kingsley, not mutually, as the family has claimed. The filing is clear: petitioner Victor Kingsley versus respondent Elara Kingsley. She turned to face the courtroom, her voice carrying. By filing for divorce within 7 years, Victor Kingsley triggered an automatic forfeiture of his primary beneficiary status. His 30% share of trust distributions, currently valued at approximately $10 million annually, is now subject to redistribution. The gallery erupted. Journalists typed frantically. Diane Kingsley made a small, choked sound. "Order," Judge Rothstein said calmly, though her eyebrows had risen. "Ms. Chun, what is the plaintiff seeking?" "Enforcement of the trust as written, Your Honor." Ms. Kingsley qualifies as a contingent beneficiary under the terms clearly outlined in Section 7B. She's entitled to transparency, audit rights, and a portion of the forfeited distribution as mandated by the trust document itself. Judge Rothstein turned to the defense table. "Mr. Webb, your response?" Marcus Webb stood, but for the first time since Elara had seen him in court, he looked uncertain. "Your Honor, the trust was designed to protect the family from gold diggers and opportunists." Patricia interrupted. "Yes, we've heard this characterization repeatedly, but the trust doesn't discriminate based on the trustee's opinion of someone's motives. It has clear, objective triggers. Marriage within 7 years, divorce initiated by the beneficiary. Both conditions are met. The trust must be enforced as written." "Mr. Webb," the judge prompted. He shuffled papers, consulted with Victor in whispered tones, then stood again. "Your Honor, we argue that the clause was never intended to apply in circumstances where intention is irrelevant," Judge Rothstein said. "The document is clear. Unless you're arguing the trust itself is invalid." A heavy pause. "No, Your Honor. Then it must be enforced as written." She turned to Richard Kingsley. "Mr. Kingsley, as trust administrator, Do you dispute the plaintiff's interpretation of Section 7B? Richard stood slowly, looking 20 years older than he had at Christmas. No, Your Honor. The interpretation is correct. Diane Kingsley gasped audibly. Howard's head dropped into his hands. Then the only question, Judge Rothstein continued, is the exact calculation of the contingent beneficiary distribution. She looked at Patricia. What is the plaintiff seeking? Based on the trust redistribution formula, Ms. Kingsley is entitled to 40% of Victor Kingsley's forfeited share. Patricia pulled up a final document. That amounts to $4 million annually for the duration of the trust, plus retroactive payments from the date of divorce, and full audit rights to ensure compliance. The courtroom fell completely silent. For $1 million annually. Not a one-time settlement. An ongoing distribution. Victor stood abruptly, his face pale. That can't be. Sit down, Mr. Kingsley, Judge Rothstein said sharply. He sank back in his chair, looking like he might be sick. The judge reviewed her notes, her expression unreadable. Finally, she set down her pen and looked directly at Elara. Ms. Kingsley, did you know about this clause when you married Victor Kingsley? Elara stood, her voice steady. No, Your Honor. I learned about it only after the divorce, when I researched the documents they'd had me sign. And during your marriage, were you treated as a member of the family? A pause. Elara thought about Christmas Eve, about years of subtle cruelty and open contempt. No, Your Honor. I was treated as an outsider who didn't belong. Judge Rothstein nodded slowly. Then she looked at the Kingsley family, her expression hardening. The irony here is striking. A clause designed to protect your family from fortune hunters has instead exposed your own actions. You divorced a woman within the protected period, triggering the very penalties you sought to avoid. And you did so with such confidence in your own superiority that you never bothered to check what you were activating. Diane Kingsley stood, her composure finally shattering. Your Honor, please, you can't possibly. This will destroy. Mrs. Kingsley, sit down. The judge's voice was ice. I'm not interested in your family's embarrassment. I'm interested in the law. Diane remained standing, trembling with rage and fear. That woman manipulated my son. That woman, Judge Rothstein interrupted, followed the law, which is more than I can say for your family's handling of this divorce. She turned back to her documents. The trust is clear, the triggers are documented, and the plaintiff is entitled to enforcement. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The courtroom exploded. Journalists rushed for the doors. The gallery erupted in conversation. Cameras flashed despite the no photography rule. Through it all, Elara sat perfectly still, the reality slowly settling over her. She'd won. Patricia gripped her hand under the table, squeezing once. David Morrison nodded with satisfaction. Across the aisle, the Kingsley family sat in ruins. Diane had collapsed back in her seat, her face buried in her hands. Howard stared straight ahead, unseeing. Helena and Margot clung to each other, their earlier arrogance completely evaporated. And Victor sat with his elbows on the table, his head in his hands, the full weight of his choices finally landing on his shoulders. Judge Rothstein banged her gavel. Order. I'm ordering a full trust audit to determine exact figures and establish payment schedules. The trust administrator will provide complete transparency to the plaintiff's legal team. We'll reconvene in 30 days for final calculations. She looked at the Kingsleys one last time. And let this be a lesson about the consequences of cruelty disguised as superiority. She stood, and everyone rose with her. As she exited, the courtroom descended back into chaos. Elara finally stood, her legs unsteady. Patricia and David flanked her, guiding her through the crowd of reporters shouting questions. But before they reached the door, Victor caught up to them. Elara, please. She turned. He looked broken, nothing like the confident man who'd sat silent on Christmas Eve. I didn't know, he said desperately. I swear, I didn't know about the clause. I never meant for. You meant for all of it, Elara said quietly. The courtroom noise faded around them, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of painful truth. Maybe not the legal consequences, but you meant to humiliate me. To erase me. To make me feel like I never mattered. That's not true. You sat there while your mother destroyed me. Elara continued, her voice calm but unyielding. You signed those papers days before Christmas and didn't even tell me. You took Simone Cartwright to brunch while I was still legally your wife. So no, Victor, you don't get to claim innocence now. He had no response. What could he possibly say? I cried when I signed those papers, Elara said, echoing words she'd thought but never spoken aloud in court, because I thought I'd lost everything. But what I really lost was my fear of people like you. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in a courtroom that had just witnessed the complete reversal of power. The woman they discarded as worthless had just claimed her worth, and the family that had seemed untouchable had just learned they could fall. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the city had shed its winter gray, and cherry blossoms lined the streets in bursts of pale pink. Elara stood at the window of her new apartment, a spacious two-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood with hardwood floors and enough natural light to make her old place seem like a cave by comparison, and watch people walking their dogs in the park below. The trust audit had been finalized 2 weeks ago. The numbers were real, legally binding, and deposited into an account she still couldn't quite believe belonged to her. For $1 million annually, with the first payment already received along with 3 months of retroactive compensation. She was wealthy now. Not Kingsley wealthy, but comfortable in a way she'd never imagined possible. Comfortable enough to breathe without checking her bank balance. Comfortable enough to choose what came next instead of accepting whatever life handed her. But the money wasn't what made her feel whole. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. Lunch next week? I have a friend who runs a literacy foundation. Thought you might be interested. Elara smiled and typed back, absolutely. She'd been meeting with people like that lately. Foundation directors, nonprofit organizers, educators who were doing the work she'd always cared about, but could never afford to pursue full-time. The substitute teaching job was long gone. Now she had the freedom to choose work that mattered, not just work that paid. Another text appeared, this one from a number she didn't recognize. Please. Just 5 minutes. I need to talk to you. Victor. Elara stared at the message for a long moment. He'd been trying to reach her for weeks. Texts, emails, even a handwritten letter delivered to Patricia's office. All of them said some version of the same thing. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. Can we talk? She'd ignored them all. But now, standing in her sunlit apartment with cherry blossoms outside and a future that belonged entirely to her, Elara found she didn't need to ignore him anymore. She typed coffee. Tomorrow. 10 Uhr morgens. The place near the courthouse. His response came within seconds. Thank you. The coffee shop was small and unremarkable, the kind of place where lawyers and paralegals grab caffeine between hearings. Elara arrived first, ordering a cappuccino and claiming a corner table near the window. Victor appeared 10 minutes later, looking nothing like the polished, confident man she'd married. His hair was longer, slightly unkempt. His suit was expensive but rumpled, as if he'd slept in it. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He saw her and stopped, hesitating as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. Hi, he said finally, his voice uncertain. He sat down across from her, no coffee, his hands empty and restless on the table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. You look good, Victor said eventually. Different. Stronger. I am stronger, Elara replied simply. He nodded, looking down at his hands. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you. I've written it out 100 times, practiced in front of the mirror like an idiot. But now that you're here, it all just... He trailed off, shaking his head. Seems inadequate? Elara suggested. Yeah. He looked up, and she saw genuine pain in his ice-blue eyes. I am sorry, Elara. For all of it. For Christmas Eve, for not defending you, for being too weak to stand up to my family. For everything. She took a sip of her cappuccino, considering his words. A month ago, she would have needed this apology desperately, would have clung to it as proof that what they'd had was real, that she hadn't been crazy to believe in their marriage. Now it just felt like words. Okay, she said. He blinked. Okay, I accept your apology. She set down her cup. But that doesn't change anything, Victor. You made your choices. I made mine. This isn't the beginning of us finding our way back to each other. I know, he said quickly. I mean, I hope, maybe, but I know. He rubbed his face. My mother won't speak to me. Helena and Margot act like I'm contagious. Even my father looks at me differently now, like I'm a disappointment he has to tolerate. Because you cost them money, Elara said, and power, and their image of invincibility. Because I was stupid enough to believe them when they said you didn't matter. His voice cracked slightly. You did matter. You do matter. And I threw that away because I was too scared to. He stopped, composing himself. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. What I had. What I lost. Elara felt something shift in her chest, but it wasn't the painful tearing she'd expected. It was more like a door closing gently, with finality, but without violence. I'm glad you see it, she said. I really am. Because for a long time, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything good between us. Thought maybe your family was right, and I'd just been delusional. You weren't delusional, Victor said fiercely. What we had was real. I was just too weak to protect it. You were, Elara agreed. But I'm not angry about it anymore. He looked surprised. You're not. No. She realized as she said it that it was true. The rage that had burned in her after Christmas, the hurt that had kept her awake nights, it had transformed into something else entirely. Not forgiveness, exactly, but release. I spent so much energy being angry at you, at your family, and myself for not being enough. But I was always enough, Victor. Your family was just too blinded by their own arrogance to see it. I know that now, he said quietly. Good. She finished her cappuccino. But knowing it now doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give me back the years I spent trying to shrink myself to fit into your world. It doesn't erase Christmas Eve. I know, he repeated, helpless. Elara stood, gathering her purse. I hope you figure out who you are without your family's approval, Victor. I really do. Because that person, the one who talked to me about books in the library, who made me laugh, who promised to protect me, that person was worth knowing. He stood too. Can I call you sometime? Not about us, just as friends. She considered it. A month ago, the answer would have been a definite no. But standing here now, looking at this man who'd hurt her, but who she'd once loved, Elara found she didn't need to carry that bitterness anymore. Maybe, she said, someday, when enough time has passed that we can actually be friends instead of just two people pretending the past doesn't hurt. How long is that? He asked. I don't know, but I'll let you know when I get there. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Elara. She looked back. You're going to do amazing things, he said. Without me, without my family's name or money. You're going to be exactly who you were always meant to be. Something warm bloomed in her chest. Not love. That was gone, transformed into something gentler and less complicated. But recognition, maybe, of the truth in his words. I know, she said simply. And she walked out of the coffee shop into the spring sunshine. 2 months later, Elara stood in the community center in the neighborhood where she'd grown up. The one with the worn carpet and the bulletin board covered in flyers for food banks and job training programs. She just signed the papers to fund a new literacy program, complete with a library, tutoring services, and after-school programs for kids who needed them most. The director, a woman named Carmen who'd been running the center for 20 years on shoestring budgets and pure determination, had tears in her eyes. This is going to change lives, Carmen said, gripping Elara's hands. You understand that? Real lives. Kids who thought college was impossible are going to have a chance now. Elara thought about the girl she'd been. The one who'd lost her parents and worked 3 jobs to finish her degree. The one who'd volunteered at libraries because she couldn't afford to do anything else. The one who'd believed education was the only path out of poverty. I know, Elara said, because I was one of those kids once. She left the community center as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her phone buzzed. An email from Patricia about another foundation interested in partnering with her on educational initiatives. Elara smiled and pocketed her phone without responding. That could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she just wanted to walk. She passed the library where she'd met Victor 4 years ago, a lifetime ago, felt like now. She didn't go in, didn't need to reclaim that space or rewrite that memory. It was what it was, the beginning of a chapter that had ended badly, but had also, in its own painful way, led her here. To freedom, to purpose, to herself. The Kingsleys were still wealthy, still influential, but their facade of invincibility had cracked. Diane had retreated from public life, appearing at fewer and fewer events. Victor had taken a position at a nonprofit abroad, self-imposed exile, the society pages called it. The family name still carried weight, but now it carried whispers too. Elara didn't gloat about it, didn't feel the savage satisfaction she'd once imagined she would. Their fall wasn't her victory. Her victory was standing here, whole and free, doing work that mattered with resources she'd earned by simply refusing to disappear. She reached her building as the street lights flickered on, climbing the stairs to her apartment with the easy rhythm of someone who belonged exactly where they were. Inside, she made tea and settled on her couch with a book she'd been meaning to read. Nothing academic, nothing urgent, just a novel someone had recommended because it was beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. Somewhere in the city, the Kingsleys were probably having dinner in their mansion, the echoes of their former glory ringing in rooms that felt emptier than before. Somewhere else, Victor was probably wrestling with regrets and what-ifs, learning to live with the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. But here, in this modest apartment filled with books and light and possibility, Elara Kingsley, soon to be Elara Monroe again, once the name change paperwork cleared, was simply living, not surviving, not proving anything, not fighting for recognition or belonging, just living, free, seen, unafraid. And that, she realized as she turned the page of her book, was the only revenge that had ever mattered. Not their fall, but her rise.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Subscribe, like, and click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.